All right, good afternoon. This is Mary Cannon with Serve Ohio. Thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. I am recording this presentation to make available then on our website so you can access it in the future or share it with your colleagues if needed. So, as we move through the conversation today, the presentation will last approximately a little over an hour, and I've left some time for questions. Don't feel you have to wait until the end to answer questions. Feel free to um, chime in either in the chat box or on the phone. I'll be monitoring the chat box as we move through. So if we come across a section that you have questions, please address them at that time. And then I will also have questions at the end of the session today. The majority of the conversation today will focus on documents, the application documents that have been made available. Primarily two documents, the Notice of Funding Opportunity or NOFO and the Ohio AmeriCorps application instructions. So I will reference those throughout the presentation today. Hopefully you look those over. If you have specific questions, please let me know. Um, we're going to do just a brief introduction to Serve Ohio. Some of you have already received this information, but I wanted to ensure everyone was familiar with who Serve Ohio is. So we are the Ohio Commission on Service and Volunteerism. We were created over 20 years ago to specifically administer Ohio AmeriCorps grants. It's a federal-state partnership. The AmeriCorps funding is a federal program through through the Corporation for National Community Service. And we receive those dollars and administer them for the state of Ohio. Currently, we have AmeriCorps funding grants equaling just about 7.3 million. And we do that by partnering with organizations across the state. We currently have 25 partner organizations that are engaging more than 800 AmeriCorps members. And those organizations and programs are leveraging millions in local public and private support. So AmeriCorps, as I alluded to, it is a federal grant. It helps organizations design and operate AmeriCorps programs to strengthen your organizational capacity to meet an identified community need. It's done by engaging AmeriCorps members and community volunteers. The program must be in line with your organization's mission and cannot duplicate or supplant pre-existing activities, staff, or volunteers. So, what can AmeriCorps programs do? We have a variety of programs across very specific focus areas that I will go into in more detail. But for example, they provide services in health, employment, and education, all the way from early education to adult education as well. And so, what's unique to our programs are the AmeriCorps members who provide those direct service activities. You can think of them as boots on the ground across our state, getting things done for our communities. And who are those AmeriCorps members? Um, if you're at all familiar with AmeriCorps, you'll know they're not a volunteer with your organization. They're not a staff person either, but they're someone who has been contracted for a term of national service. And those terms can be anywhere from 300 to 1,700 hours per term. And I'll talk in much more detail about those terms and what that means. Um, they must be a U.S. citizen, either a legal permanent resident alien of the U.S. They have to be at least 17 years of age, and if they are 17, it does require a parent or guardian signature, and they cannot exit high school to enroll into AmeriCorps. But there really is no upper age limit. Programs can set parameters around age limits if it is an intentional part of the program design. So let's say it's a senior to senior companion type program. You can certainly set some limitations around who you're trying to recruit into your program if it makes sense for that program need and population served. The members receive their Eli Siegel Educational Award upon successful completion of their term of service. So when they complete all the requirements and their hours, they get a Siegel Ed Award. That you can think of it as a scholarship. Currently, for a full-time AmeriCorps member, it's about approximately $6,000 for a term of service. Those members will also receive a living allowance. Full-time members are eligible for health insurance, and based on individual circumstances, some of those members may be eligible for child care if they have children. Many of them are eligible for reimbursement through the corporation or through local support. And then any sort of criteria a program sets in terms of experience or skill set, they must meet that criteria. And then these members are individuals who are deployed into very specific communities. And those communities can be a neighborhood, it can be a block, it can be a city. It just depends on where the need exists. And they will help you achieve your organization's mission and get things done. So, who's eligible for a grant? We have nonprofit organizations, higher ed institutions, government entities. We have municipal entities. We have state entities. We have Indian tribes. Most of our programs are done in partnership or as a consortium. And so that's a very common model. If you're proposing to operate a program in multiple states, so across state borders, um, you must apply to the Corporation for National Community Service. Now, if you're looking to partner with an adjoining state, perhaps that could come through us, absolutely. So, if you're looking at a state or a nationwide program, that's something that would have to go through the Corporation for National Community Service. That request would have to go to our federal funder. So, I'm going to in much more detail talk about these application documents today. So let me run through them quickly just to give you an overview of what is available currently. So we have the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or what we call the NOFO. That details exactly the type of funding that's available, the purpose of AmeriCorps funding, um, also the and then the narrative, which I will go in much more detail in terms of the narrative. And we have the application instructions, which are detail the budget instructions. So I will go through that very briefly. I will defer most of that conversation to our grants workshop, which will happen next month. But the application instructions are important companion document to the Notice of Funding Opportunity. So those two documents need to be read in tandem to each other. The mandatory supplemental guidance is basically a glossary, and it goes into detail about some terms you may see in the Notice of Funding and application instructions. Those two items have, AmeriCorps, we have our own vernacular, and so any item that you're not clear about, you can look into the mandatory supplemental guidance, and that will provide a description and details. We will go to this document for the evidence levels, and those are detailed in that document, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. All right, the intent to apply. This is a required document. Even if you are not sure if your organization will be applying this spring for an AmeriCorps grant, it is highly suggested that you submit the intent to apply to me. That allows eligibility to submit a grant, and part of that process is I will give feedback on that document. And so the second half of that document is what is called a concept paper. And there's 10, 11, 12 questions that helps you walk through the elements of an application. And in very brief details, you can give me an overview of what you're thinking in terms of your program. I will give you feedback on that, and that will allow for you to understand what the expectations are of AmeriCorps, and any elements that perhaps are not clear or that need to be expanded upon in a grant application. The financial management survey, that is required of all new applicants. It's a very detailed document. It asks and pertains to your organization's policies and procedures and your fiscal oversight, particularly as it pertains to federal grants. So I highly recommend looking at that document and providing it to your fiscal department or staff, and so that they can start combining all the materials needed for that. Along with that document is some additional requested items that will be sent in as a packet with that document. So make sure you can access that survey and that is complete upon submission. So all of our documents are found on our grants funding page. And let me show you where that is. Bear with me while I show you. So here's our website. Hopefully you're seeing the service experiences. Here's Servo, Ohio. If you go to grants funding page, it's taking a moment. Here we are. This is where you can find all of the application materials that I'm discussing today. Here is the fiscal survey, and here is the intent to apply. Once, and the presentation is already posted. It's here on our website under the technical assistance presentation. So if you need to reference this back, it's on our website here. This is the presentation, and there's some additional application resources here. And I'll reference these throughout the conversation today. So I just wanted you to see all of this is available to you on our grants funding page from our main website. So let me go back to the presentation now, and we'll continue on. So starting with the notice of funding, we're going to examine the notice of funding first. The first thing you'll see in the notice of funding is the focus areas, and I want to talk a little bit about those. So funding priorities are just that. They are priorities. It does not mean that we will not fund programs that fall outside of these focus areas, but they are priorities for us. Economic opportunity programming, we're looking for programming that supports specifically opportunity youth, so individuals that are in 16 to 24 age range, disconnected with school or work, and so there's an opportunity for them to either become an AmeriCorps member or be on the receiving end of services, or a combination of both. It just depends on your program design. We're also looking at educational programming, looking to expand our programming in STEM as well as in summer-specific programming. So programming that addresses a summer-specific need, which would occur in the summer of 2019. So be cautious of that. Encore programming, we're looking at programming that looks to engage individuals of that age range of 55 plus to become AmeriCorps members. And then we're also have a funding priority for a governor and mayor initiative. And this does require our approval, prior approval to submitting a grant. And that can happen at time of intent to apply, no later than the intent to apply is due. But that's looking at the governor and one mayor and two nonprofits and a community signing off and collaborating on an identified community need. And that need can run the gamut in terms of need. It can address multiple focus areas. It can be very specific on one focus area. Excuse me. Another one is Healthy Futures, so helping communities reduce and prevent prescription drug and opioid abuse. That could happen in the summer, and it can happen during the school year. It can happen year-round, but we're also looking at ways to engage summer health and wellness, Healthy Futures opportunities, addressing those specific needs during the summer. We're also looking at programming around rural intermediaries, so rural communities coming together and collaborating and addressing needs from a identified community lens. Um, it can run the gamut in terms of the rural need. It can be, healthy futures focused. It can be education focused. It just depends. But looking at providing rural communities more additional support. And then veterans and military families, so that's engaging veterans and military families either in service programming or on the receiving end of service programming. So helping them perhaps translate their military careers to civilian life, helping them be engaged, helping them. We have a lot of volunteers, a lot of veterans that have uh, done service terms, another way to continue their commitment to their country, and so those that programming can run it again a gamut of whatever those veteran and military family needs are, and that can be very specific to a community. So the funding priorities also mentions evidence-based and evidence-informed program designs. So there is a requirement within your application to identify if your program is being evidence informed through your own organizational success, or if you're looking at evidence-based data and research and evaluation. So if you're perhaps replicating a program based on research um, or evaluation of a similar program. So you're looking at whether your program, the program that you're asking for funding, if that proposed direct service or what we call intervention, what the members will be providing is guided by the best available research and evidence that supports its effectiveness. So, what data, what research, what evaluation do you have at your disposal to say the outcomes are likely to occur based on this program design? There's this evidence-based and evidence-informed information pertains very specifically to there's an evidence-based section in the grant application, and I'll go through that in more detail um, in just a moment. But the mandatory supplemental guidance, starting on page 1 and going through page, I think it's 6, no 5, um, details the various levels of evidence that you will um, determine your program to be at, and each of those levels of evidence, whether it's strong or moderate or preliminary, for example, has very specific requirements for each. So my recommendation is to understand what evidence exists for your program design, and then reading through those levels of evidence and determining which one your program likely is, and then um, ensuring all the requirements are met for that section. It's a very technical section. If you have any questions about it, if you're reading through it and you're not sure if your program meets a certain level, I'm happy to have that conversation with you um, prior to the blackout period, which I'll talk a little bit in just a moment. But there's also a um, workshop and under the application resources on our website. It's called Best Practices for Demonstrating Evidence. It's a presentation that was given in the past. It helps you understand how to determine your program's level of evidence based on CNCS definitions, and then what you need to do to submit in response. Um, so if we keep navigating through the notice of funding elements, you're going to come to page 12. This is where you will find exactly what you need to put into the narrative sections of the application. And this is going to be the focus of our conversation today. So starting on page 12 of the notice of funding, I'm going to actually bring that up for you so you can look at it. One second. The notice of funding trying to avoid scrolling on the screen so that you don't get dizzy. The application review information. This is where you will start seeing the details in terms of what is required in each narrative section. So starting on page 11 and going to page 12, you'll see there's an executive summary. That's a required element. Do not deviate from the template below. You are to use this template and fill in the blanks. No additional executive summary information is required. It's very brief, very concise, paragraph or two. Okay. The next section will be divided into the program design section. And under this section, there are 5 elements. There's the need, and this is where you'll detail the problem the program will address. You will also identify where in which community or communities the members will serve, and that the relevant data is included to identify the community in question. And community is, you will identify and define your community. Community can be a geographic region, it can be a specific population of people, or a combination of both. But you'll be very specific on where that community is and how you've identified that community. The next two, or the number 2, actually has 2 pieces that go with it. Narratively, you will have a theory of change. So a theory of change relates to your program's logic model. And a theory of change is identifying what the issue at hand is, what the community need is, how it will be addressed, and what the likely outcome will be. Very on a high level, these are the elements of a theory of change. So again, you're going to identify the primary intervention to address the community need, and how that intervention will likely lead to the outcomes identified. Each of these bullet points are provided to guide your narrative design. Please don't respond to the narrative in bullet form. Please include clear and good paragraphs and sentence structures. But these elements should, at some point within your theory of change section, all of these bullet points should be addressed. Now, you will also have a logic model that is a companion piece to your theory of change. These 2 pieces go together. There's actually, separate from the narrative section within eGrants, there's a logic model framework that you'll complete. So if your program does not have a logic model, I suggest starting to work on it now. And a logic model, as you may be aware, is a physical representation of your program in very concise format. It's basically an outline of your program narrative. And we have identified elements that are required in the logic model. So you'll identify the very specific number of locations the members will serve, how many members will deliver each of the interventions, and when the members will serve. You'll then identify the activities, how long the duration of that intervention, how long in total each of those activities will occur, whether it's a weekly or monthly, or and then you'll identify during that time frame how many times the intervention will be delivered. So how many during that week will a tutoring session occur, or during the month will a tutoring session occur, for example. You'll then reiterate your target population, who is going to be on the receiving end of that intervention, and then you'll include your measurable outputs and outcomes. So if you have not started, or you perhaps maybe do not have a logic model for your program, I highly recommend starting on that now. It is a visual representation of the applicant's theory of change. And I have a template that is based on the CNCS template for a logic model. This is also on our application resources page. And so you will fill in the blanks as necessary. Not all programs have, short and medium and long-term outcomes. That's fine as long as, an outcome is identified for your program. Typically, the short-term or long-term outcomes are the outcomes that are measurable in a program time frame, and then the long-term is more of the, uh, world peace is achieved, right? And so making sure perhaps what can you measure in terms of outcomes in a program year is an important consideration to think through. Any questions about the logic model or theory of change so far? Okay, great. Now, the next section is that evidence-based section. This is that very technical section. So based on what evidence you have available to demonstrate that your program will likely deliver the outcomes proposed is where you put this information. This is not evidence about the need for, overall mentoring or tutoring programs or healthy futures programming. This section is to highlight your specific program and its evidence to support its likelihood for success. Okay, so a lot of people see this evidence-based section and think, oh, there's evidence to demonstrate multitude of evidence demonstrating the need for mentoring in general, for example. But that's not what we're looking for here. This is about your program design and why it's been designed specifically as it is. So making sure that you're clear on that. There's some details here about identifying your evidence tier. You'll find um, there's a multitude of evidence tiers that your program could fall into, and that is found in the mandatory supplemental guidance. So that's an important document to go to when you come to this section. Go to this document and navigate to the evidence tiers section starting on page 2 through 5 so that those two pieces go together. Okay, great. I'm not going to go into much more detail about that because this section is very specific to each program. So I would recommend reading through this and that section in the glossary in the mandatory supplemental guidance. And if you have specific questions, I'd be happy to answer those. Now, the next section narratively is the notice priority. This is where you will identify if your program meets the funding priority criteria and you're applying under that notice funding priority, this is where you will, in a paragraph, no more than 2, identify that you are applying under that funding priority and that you meet all the requirements based on that specific priority. Member experience. So this is when our grants start getting really unique. So, they're all unique in so many sections, but this is unique to AmeriCorps. So we're looking at AmeriCorps members and making sure that once they go through the program, they will gain skills as a result of their training. So what are those skills, and how will that help them in their quote unquote life after AmeriCorps? How will going through your program elevate them in their career and their professional development? So how will they benefit from their experience? And then looking at, will your program recruit members from the communities in which they'll be serving? And looking at how will your program foster an inclusive culture? So ensuring there's respect for everyone that is serving, differences perhaps are discussed, reflection on service time can occur. So looking at making sure that this is a learning environment, a positive learning environment for all of the members, regardless of backgrounds and situations. So that is the final section in the program design. Any questions? Okay. The next section will focus on your organization's capability to implement the program that you're requesting funding for. So, the first one is about your organizational background and staffing. So, does the organization have the experience, staffing, and structure to plan and implement the proposed program? And it's important here to also say how this program aligns with your mission and perhaps maybe what other success you've had in implementing a similar program like this. So this is a good place to um, highlight your success as an organization. All right, as a federal grant, the next section we're talking about compliance and accountability. Ensuring that your program will adhere to all rules and regulations, making sure that if you have partners, um, program partners, how you will work with them and perhaps service locations to be held accountable if noncompliance items are identified, and then how ensuring that all reporting is um, identified and provided to internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. And that relates to very much this next section, this culture that values learning. So, in terms of accountability, but also then looking to make informed decision, how and when and where and who do you share with, programming information on a regular basis. How does your organization collect and use information for learning and decision making? And then what sort of policies or processes has your organization or plan to implement for this program to make sure that um, communication and learning is shared both internal and external to the program, but within your organization. So that sections will be unique to each organization's culture. We understand that, but if you can provide some details about how the program AmeriCorps will perhaps fit within your current culture of learning. All right, the next section is specific to member supervision. So members must receive sufficient guidance and support from their supervisor and or program staff. Now this will depend on if your program is purely quote unquote in-house, so if all of your members are serving internal to your organization or if members are serving external with partner institutions at various host sites. How will the program make sure that members are receiving sufficient guidance? Have you identified a site supervisor for each location? When will those supervisors receive training and guidance? How often will the supervisors communicate to the program? How often will members be expected to communicate with their supervisors and so on and so forth? So making sure the members have the day-to-day support as well as making sure that they are adequately trained and prepared to follow program rules and expectations. Okay, great. The next sections you'll see is cost effectiveness and budget adequacy. And this is a very simple section, and all you have to write in this narrative section is the budget because this information will be evaluated based on the budget that you submit with your grant application. So for this section, very simple in the narrative, all you need to enter is the budget. So any questions about those elements of the application narrative? Okay, great. So let me move on. The final narrative section is an evaluation plan section. For a new applicant, what you'll be including here is a data collection plan, and it will include these two bullet points here. You'll detail your plan for collecting data, what data systems you already have, or are you going to be implementing a new system? And you'll need to talk about how the applicant will use that data to monitor and improve program efficiency. And so making sure that you describe your plan and timeline for either developing or implementing a high quality data collection and reporting system. All the other sections in the narrative you will enter NA. There's nothing else required in the narrative section. So let me go back to the presentation. So we just went over the evaluation plan component. Data collection plan is highlighted on page 16. It is also in the mandatory supplemental guidance as well. It's called the learning or data collection plan. And then the other elements you'll see in the narrative, you will just enter NA in each of those sections. If you don't put anything in those sections, it won't let you submit the grant application. So make sure there's something in those application sections within the eGrant system. All right. Now, in addition to the narrative components, there is some additional documentation that's required, and it is listed on the notice of funding, pages 10 and 11. So let me go over these in more detail. So we've already discussed the fiscal management survey. That is required for all new applicants at the time of application. The letters of support. So if you are having partners that will be participating in the program, we would like to have those community partner letters. They would be addressed to your organization, highlighting the importance of the program and how the program will benefit their organization. And then those letters will come via email to me at time of application. If you are planning on having 20 partners, I would say select the primary partners for the program. If they all are part of a steering committee for the program, then they can all submit a letter of support. But I'll let you determine who you would consider your primary partners and identifying those letters of support. The other piece you'll have to submit is the organizational chart. And the organizational chart should include a little bubble or bracket where the AmeriCorps program will fit or sit within your organization. And then evaluation reports. So depending on that evidence-based section that you completed narratively, each of the various levels of evidence have different requirements in terms of what you have to include in each section. There are two levels of evidence that are called moderate and strong. And if you are identifying your program in either one of those evidence tiers, then you'll have to submit evaluation reports along with your application. Each of these items are provided in much more detail in the notice of funding on pages 10 and 11. The other piece that is actually within the eGrants application system, but it's separate from the narrative pieces, is that logic model that we discussed earlier in relation to the theory of change section. You'll fill in the blanks of each row for each primary and secondary intervention, and then that will be submitted along with your grant in the application system, but it is separate from where the narrative pieces are. And here is, if you do not have a program logic model, this is an easy slide presentation that helps you walk you through how to put together a logic model. Logic models look a lot of different ways, but I'm going to tell you it's a very specific template that is used by the Corporation for National Community Service, and this model or this presentation walks you through that specific model. I find it easier to start with the outcomes and work left, but you can absolutely, however you feel most comfortable with your logic model development. But this is a resource for you if necessary. Okay, there's two very important pieces that are also submitted with your application that are not part of the narrative pieces. There is a section where you will include a performance measure. Now, a performance measure is an outcome-based measure. It includes at least at minimum one output and one outcome that you will identify within your logic model. So each program and grant application is required to submit at least one performance measure. And the application instructions on how to actually submit within the eGrant system a performance measure is included in the application instructions. So this is an important document. If you go to page 17 of this document, you will find the performance measure instructions on how to physically or mechanically within the application system submit your performance measures. Keep in mind that each application is required to identify one performance measure for your program, which is at minimum one output and one outcome. Some programs have more than one outcome, two perhaps. This measure is to identify and track your program's primary direct service activity. So you will identify what your program's primary direct service activity is. If members are providing tutoring to third graders, then I would recommend that probably will be your primary service activity. And then you will submit a corresponding performance measure related to that. So you will identify what you consider to be the program's primary service activity and submit a performance measure to capture that activity. You will submit targets, a numerical value, not a percentage, but an actual numerical value within the performance measure to have goals for both the output and the outcome. So for example, if you say the program would like to serve 100 students and 50% of those students will demonstrate gains in math, your output target would be 100 and your outcome target would be 50. So you use actual numerical data in those target fields. Keep in mind that the targets are for 1 year only. So at the end of one program year, what do you hope to accomplish? What do you expect the members to do during the one program year? Any questions about performance measures? I'm going to mention one more thing about performance measures. The Corporation for National Community Service actually has some standardized performance measures that they call national performance measures. And they are divided by focus areas. So if your program is within Healthy Futures, there's Healthy Futures specific performance measures. There's education specific measures. There's environmental stewardship specific measures. There's veterans and military families specific measures. So I would recommend reviewing those measures and identifying if there's measures that align and match what your program design is, then you can use those standard performance measures. So those have already been created. And I will go in much more detail at the grants workshop about the national performance measures and how you would select a measure. What are the requirements of the various measures? So that I will go into much more detail than I am today at the grant workshop next month. But know that that document exists and that there's some measures that are already created and standardized that programs can select to report on if those measures match your program design. There is also in the application instructions very specific budget guidelines. Budgets are submitted for 1 year. So based on 1 year based on a 1-year program, uh, is how you should frame your budget. Starting on page 22 of our application instructions is where you can find the details on all components that are required in an AmeriCorps budget. Now, this is multiple pages of details. So this is what we will also focus on at the grants workshop next month. So this slide, the performance measure and the budget instructions, will be elaborated much more in the grant workshop. But prior to that, please review the performance measure instructions and the budget instructions so that you can come with very specific questions to each of those. Okay. So we're going to continue on this vein of budget. So if you have any questions, this is where a lot of questions start to roll in. So don't hesitate to ask any questions about this. We're going to continue kind of looking at budgets. So when you would submit a grant, they include our request for a very specific number of AmeriCorps member slots or terms. And those slots and terms will be added for a total member service year request, or MSY. Yes, the grant workshop will be at the State Library on April 2nd in Columbus from 1 to 4:30 p.m. If you would like to attend, all you need to do is email me to RSVP, and I'll provide more details. Absolutely, you're welcome. So when you submit a grant, you will think about very specifically how many AmeriCorps member slots you want and how many the types of terms each of those slots represent. And you will add those together to create a member service year request. And you can think of an MSY as an equivalency for how much time all the members combined will contribute to your program or grant. So we have a variety of slot types and service terms that are available. And this should all be based on how much effort and time should be attributed to a need. So we have a full-time slot, and that slot, if a member elects to enroll into a full-time slot, they must contribute at least 1,700 hours. That is the equivalent of one MSY, or one member service year. And from there, it is reduced to various levels. So we also have half-time AmeriCorps member slots. Someone serving in a half-time AmeriCorps member slot must complete at least 900 hours, and that is the equivalency of a 0.5 MSY, and so on and so forth. So you have these options that are available to you. So you can be very intentional and specific on how many slots you need to address your need and how much time each AmeriCorps member can contribute or should contribute to the need in your community. So you would add up all the slots and all the MSY to see what your total request would be. So for an example, if an application submits a request for one full-time, one half-time, one quarter-time, and one minimum time, that request would total 4 slots, but a total of 1.977 member service years. I'm going to tell you that's not an eligible request. You cannot submit a request for that little, for 4 member slots in less than 2 MSYs, but it's just an example to show you how you identify both of those numbers. All right. Any questions about the MSY? And I'll show you another example here in just a moment, because there's 2 very important but distinct numbers that you need to be aware of as you move through this process. There is what we call a maximum cost per member service year, or MSY. There's a table Table number 2 on page 9 of the Notice of Funding that details what the cost per MSY is each program year. A cost per MSY is important. So when you add up all your MSY, then you have to figure out that you meet this requirement. Each program can request no more than $14,932 to support each MSY. Now understand that each MSY might be 2 half-time positions or 4 quarter-time positions, but they equal 1 MSY. And that ceiling or that request can be no more than $14,932 to support each MSY requested in your grant. This gets confused a lot with the member living allowance value. Table 1 on page 8 of the Notice of Funding explains the stipend minimum and maximum levels by slot or service term. Full-time members are required to receive a living allowance that is no less than $13,732. But members serving in less than full-time slots are not required to receive a living allowance, but we have made some recommendations in terms of those values. We like all AmeriCorps members to receive some level of living allowance if they're not serving in a full-time capacity. And we've made some recommendations there in that grid. But know that these are two very important numbers, but very distinct numbers that you'll see referenced throughout all of these application documents. There's a cost per MSY that you must abide to, but then there's also a living allowance value, and that will determine on the slot type in terms of value for each slot type. Any questions about the MSY? And I will show you how to determine what your MSY is in just a moment. Okay, great. Now, keep in mind that these, all of our new AmeriCorps grants are cost reimbursement grants. So there is some elements that are required in terms of the name, cost reimbursement. So resources are extended and then reimbursed from the AmeriCorps grant. Any pre-approved expense in a grant budget is allowable for reimbursement. There must be a 24% match when you submit your grant, and I'll show you how to determine that value. It's really a cost share design. Our grants are really cost share. They're not necessarily a matching percentage. You must abide by that cost per MSY maximum that we just discussed, that $14,932. And all funds are directly tied to that specific number of members and are solely for program expenses. So you cannot use that request to do general operational costs. And grants must request no less than 10 MSYs. So when you add up all the slot types and the equivalency of the MSY for that slot type, that request must be no less than 10 MSYs. And that can be accomplished through a variety of member slot types or all of the same slot types. So here's an example. So if you have a request for 10 member service years, that you want 20 half-time AmeriCorps members. Remember, a half-time AmeriCorps slot is a 0.5 MSY, so that's a 10 MSY request. So if you want to request 10 member service years, the maximum you can request to support each of those service years is that $14,932. So the maximum federal side or grant request that you can include in your budget is just under $150,000, so $149,320. Because of the match, that amount can be no more than 76% of the total grant cost. Your share through cash and in-kind resources must be at least 24% for the first 3 years of a grant. And again, budgets are submitted for one program year each year. So this is only for 1 year. you would have to submit a grant that would have a 24% match. Then those combined values equal your total grant request. Any questions? To determine your cost per MSY, you have to look at your federal share, only the 76%, and you divide it by how many total MSY you're requesting in the grant, and that must be no more than the 14,932. Yes, absolutely. In kind can be part of your share. Now, because of the nature of our grants being cost reimbursement, they cannot be solely in kind. There does need to be some cash resources available, particularly at the beginning to launch a program, because members will need their stipends and there'll be those upfront operational costs. But yes, in kind and typical in kind is usually supervisor time, yes, and any other, if there's training, in kind training, in kind, any kind of supplies or resources to support the program. Absolutely. Great question. All right. I just want to check the chat box really quick to make sure I didn't miss anything. All right, great. All right, we're going to move on. Any other questions for this example? Again, we're going to talk in much more detail about the grant, how you put a grant together at the grant workshop. All right, so, excuse me. So, some important components to consider. Ohio AmeriCorps grants expand the capacity of your organizations to meet their mission and identify critical community needs. I have to advise you, it's typical, I guess, for me to receive an intent to apply for a program from an organization that the program falls outside of their organizational mission and vision. So I just want to make sure that hits home, that this is an opportunity to expand and augment either current resources, reach a new audience in terms of services, provide gaps in services that you're already providing. So this is a way to help you expand your organizational capacity to meet those needs that you've identified. Organizations that receive the Ohio AmeriCorps grants are responsible for recruiting and finding and managing the members to serve in their programs. There is an online portal. It is a national online portal that individuals from across the country can apply to any AmeriCorps program that exists. And so we do have members that every year move to Ohio to serve with programming. But we do find programs are most successful with recruitment with their current close and internal stakeholders. So anyone who is currently engaged with your program, this is a great opportunity as a volunteer, intern, or community recipient or community stakeholder to be more engaged in your organization and to provide it an excellent opportunity to help you meet those program goals. We have some required programmatic and financial reporting. In general, we have quarterly reports that programs submit and demonstrate their progress in meeting their performance measures. So there's outputs and outcomes that have been approved in their grant. Those are reported on quarterly. And then no less than quarterly financial reports are submitted, including end-of-year additional documentation. And AmeriCorps grants are not for individual placements. We do not provide individual AmeriCorps member slots. So if your program just wants 1 or 2 AmeriCorps members, we do not provide requests for that. Typically, issues and needs can be met more effectively through partnerships, and so we hope that programs will look to other like-minded and mission-minded organizations to build a program across organizations to help meet those needs. So we do not provide individual member placement. So we already shared earlier about the grant workshop, but this is an excellent opportunity to come and sit with me and our grants officer. We will have time set aside that afternoon. We will go in much more detail about the application process. We'll go into eGrants, which is our system. It's also linked here. We do not use grants.gov. We use our own system, and it's called eGrants. So if you have not been into eGrants yet, I highly recommend going in there and creating an account already and navigating system. It is a unique system, so you're familiar with what would be required and where to place all of the information we just discussed. And I'll pull that up in a minute. Oh yeah, so the reporting, so we have fiscally, we have periodic expense reports, which allow for no less than quarterly expenses to be reimbursed from the grant. So a periodic or PER is submitted to us on a quarterly basis. Some programs submit them even monthly based on their expenses, and that is what allows for reimbursement from the grant. And then we also have quarterly progress reports that are submitted in response to reporting and tracking your approved performance measures that you submitted with the grant and in your logic model. So the outcomes and outputs are reported on a quarterly basis as well. Those reports are submitted in a system that we give you access to. It's called AmeriCorps. All of our programs use that to track and report their expenses and performance measures. So if you have not already RSVP'd, please do so to attend the grant workshop. People find, I've been told that it's very, very helpful in understanding all the requirements, as well as having very discussion with other applicants, and also answering specific questions about programs and requirements. So it will be led by myself and our grants officer. After that, please submit the intent to apply by 5 p.m. That isn't just an email that is sent to me, along with that attached document, the intent to apply, and the concept paper. The intent to apply has two elements. The first element is the program information and how many members you expect to request. And then the second half is a narrative, just an outline or framework of the program that you're anticipating to as you feel it exists now. Now there will be some holes and some gaps. You may not know everything at the time of submission of the intent to apply, and that's fine. It's no more than 3 or 4 pages. So I don't expect a whole application at the time of intent to apply, but generally, how will the program be formulated and designed? And then you must submit applications by May 2nd by 5 p.m. in eGrants. That is the very latest. You can obviously submit it to me earlier, but no later than May 2nd. That is also the deadline for any additional documentation that's required with your grant. That would include the fiscal management survey, the letters of support, and the organizational chart, and if applicable, any sort of evaluation reports connected to your evidence base. All right, just making sure that you understand too the requirements of an AmeriCorps grant. Now that we've gone through all of that, I think it's important to take a step back and understand what is your capacity to implement an AmeriCorps grant. We always want to recommend, as you start out this process, engaging human resources, and if you have one, your legal department in the conversation. Those two people or departments are very important and can need to be engaged in these conversations at the beginning. in terms of being what I would call mission ready to operationalize an AmeriCorps programming, making sure that the resources are available. We talked about the cost reimbursement nature of our grants. So making sure that you can launch a program and receive reimbursement for those expenses, perhaps 30 to 60 days before you receive reimbursement. Making sure you have the most up-to-date research. All right, what's been our success? And I think people overlook that piece when they're going through the narrative and the program application. It's, well, what's been our success in providing a similar service or this service, or well, how do we know we'll be successful? And so looking at your organization's mission and how does that align with your organization's goals and objectives and perhaps strategic plan. And then making sure you are not asking members to conduct any prohibited activities. As a federal grant, there are things they cannot do. Voter registration drives, any sort of advocacy work. And so if you're asking members to do that, that's not an appropriate request. So there are some prohibited activities. I think we probably can come up with a list all on our own in terms of, being a federal grant, what things they can and cannot do, but there actually is a very specific list that you can find here and available to you. And making sure everyone is around the table as you fill out this intent to apply. I recommend it being a group project, grabbing people around the table that will be involved in the implementation, including the organizational stakeholders like HR and legal if necessary, and providing that information. And making sure that you can then, as I said earlier, you'll be responsible for finding and recruiting and managing the members. So perhaps, in an ideal world, 100, it would be great to have 100 AmeriCorps members do this project, but is that really feasible for your organization currently? Maybe it's about working up to that point, but what can you manage and entertain currently? We do have a recommendation that programs include at least a 0.5 FTE to oversee and administer the program. We realize that's not always feasible, but that is a strong recommendation based on past performance and program success. So having someone who has been identified as at least a 0.5 to oversee and administer the program, and that person's time can certainly be matching dollars. And then as you think through this process and throughout your application, just thinking through how will it expand your reach, your scale, your scope, and perhaps improve efficiency and effectiveness of your programs. All right, so those again are the application documents. Each of these are linked directly to those documents that you can find on our website. The intent to apply is a Word document, as is the financial management survey. For the intent to apply, you'll have to type up some additional documentation. Please don't hand write any of this information. Our grants officer wants to make sure that anyone who submits the financial management survey that it's typed, not handwritten document. So please, that's available for you as a Word document to fill in the blanks. There's additional information. All the information I just discussed is on our grants funding page. You can go to nationalservice.gov. Perhaps you've come to the realization that maybe this is not the best resource for us. There's other AmeriCorps programming that's available out there, and that is detailed on nationalservice.gov. So perhaps you can explore other AmeriCorps resources that are available if necessary. And then the specific federal AmeriCorps regulations can be found there as well. There's my contact information. Feel free to schedule a time to talk with me or send me an email if you have any questions. So that concludes the content of the presentation. Are there any outstanding questions or items for discussion? Okay. Well, if you walk away from the conversation today And as you convene your team and think about this internally, don't hesitate to ask me questions. Um, I want to bring to your attention in terms of the application timeline. I already mentioned the grant workshop on April 2nd. I already mentioned the April 11th intent to apply. That's due by 5 p.m. There is what is called an application blackout period where I cannot discuss content for your application. I can give you technical assistance, perhaps if you are having issues, getting into e-grants or not sure where to locate the e-grants or, some of those technical questions. I can help you with that. But during the application blackout period of April 23rd through May 20th, I cannot provide details about your application content. So I highly recommend having conversations with me prior to that time. We have just over a month, so I think you have plenty of time to reach out if you have questions. Yeah, great question. So about member placement. So our grants can start no earlier than August 1 and no later than October 1. So somewhere in that time frame, members will be deployed into your community. So you would actually determine the timeline that makes most sense for your program. We really recommend for new programs no earlier than perhaps September to start members. It just gives you some time with a grant starting no earlier than August 1. Members can start after August 1, but typically no later than October 1. And so you would identify that. To have your own startup money in the beginning, yes, generally speaking, yes, because of the design of this program being a cost reimbursement design. The grant resources are expended, and then you request reimbursement through that PER, through that periodic expense report. And that amount really varies on how much you'll need to launch your program. It determines how many members you're having, what their stipend is, what startup costs you'll have. So, thinking through what that value is, I can't give you an amount, but you'll have to determine based on when the members receive their stipends, what costs will be needed to provide the members orientation and pre-service training. So those costs will all need to happen up front. Let me make sure. If you have 10 full-time members, again, it just depends on, so you'll know what their stipend is because full-time members have to receive that 13,000 plus stipend. You'll know that they'll have to receive perhaps one or two stipends before you would get reimbursed from the grant. So thinking, using that as a ballpark, depending on when they would receive their first or second stipend, for example, and then any sort of startup launching, quote unquote, launching resources. Okay, good. I'm glad that's helpful. Full time's a little easier to think about that since there are some upfront costs that would occur with full time. All right, great question. I know this is a lot of information, so please don't hesitate to contact me if you have if something's not clear. I can help you walk through the steps and point you in the right direction for additional information if anything isn't clear. Or feel free to email me. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. Just because I do travel quite a bit out to our program. So I'd be happy to have a conversation. If you want to schedule some time, be happy to do that. All right, I will let you go a few minutes early. Thank you. Um, One moment, I had a question. The blackout period, April 23rd it starts, April 23rd through May 20th. So be cautious of that. All right, very good. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for your interest and support for national service in Ohio, and have a great rest of your Friday. Take care. Bye bye.